Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we're talking about myths and misconceptions about the Enneagram personality types when you don't know the subtypes, because we believe that the subtypes, the instinct-based subtypes, the approach we use that derives from Claudio Narajano really clarifies what the types are really like and what the inner growth journey is for each of the types.
Yes, super important in my view too. I believe that people don't really understand types accurately in some points when they don't consider the differences between subtypes of a same type, and also other problems like mistyping and more. So hopefully we will make a contribution to the Enneagram world. Of course, it's our own take, our view, but that we have been testing for quite some while in practice with our many students, and we find it really accurate.
Yeah, not only have we really studied this approach to the subtypes in depth, but we also, because we work with people individually in different contexts, we've also put these subtypes to the test. So we use them in helping individuals self-develop and make progress on their growth journey. And so we've seen in practice how these subtype definitions really help clarify what are the specific nature of the 27 types, so the three versions of each of the 9 types based on which of the 3 instincts is dominant, and how understanding the specific definitions, the 3 versions of each of the 9 types with a lot of clarity helps also define the inner work to be done by each person.
Right. And I think not only misconceptions about each type, but also about the Enneagram system itself, with some understandings that we don't necessarily believe are correct when people don't know subtypes, some takes on theory.
Right. So maybe a few general comments before we maybe start talking about the types, the 9 types in general. I think one of the things that Claudio Naranjo's, what I think of as his modern description of the subtypes, includes that I don't see in other versions is the concept of countertype. So many people know, almost everyone that studies the Enneagram knows that there's a phobic 6 and a counterphobic 6, type 6. There's a 6 that's more fearful, more actively fearful, more doubting, more uncertainty, and one that goes against fear with strength, that seeks to be intimidating and assertive and even aggressive in reaction to fear. So we all know this, but I didn't realize, and until I learned this approach to the subtypes, that every type has a countertype. And again, we've seen this in practice. And sometimes if you're the counter type, it makes it harder for you to find your type. So it leads to a lot of mistyping and misunderstanding of types generally by people who are interested in the Enneagram but don't study this approach. And what we mean by counter type is for each of the 9 types, there are 2 that kind of flow with the general pattern of the type, with the passion of the type. Like if we're using 6 as the example, 2 of the types experience fear a bit more consciously and defend against it in particular ways. But then there's one, in this case, the sexual 6, the counterphobic 6, the more counterphobic 6, that goes against fear with strength and often isn't aware of fear at all. Now, the counterphobic 6 is coming as much from the passion of fear as the other 2 6s. They just aren't aware of it in the same way. And so when I was introduced to this approach, I was really surprised that Naranjo defined all 9 types as having a counter type. That one of the 3 subtypes that's kind of upside down, that sort of doesn't follow the main or easily recognizable pattern that we tend to think of as associated with a type. So we might highlight those as we go through. But also, I think it also clarifies things like wings. A lot of people think that wings are subtypes, right? So they'll say, I'm a 8 with a 7 wing, right? And I think that we think that that wings aren't subtypes, that they're more fluid, that they can be different with each person. They're more growth pathways. And knowing what a really good in-depth version of the instinct-based subtypes makes it even more clear that wings aren't really subtypes. They're more, flavorings of the main type that can vary by person.
Right. I agree with this. And I think that when people don't have the knowledge of subtypes, they attribute some type tendencies to something else. And wings is just one example.
Right.
I think there are other mistakes. And of course, in the beginning, of the study, especially when American teachers were not in touch with the accumulated knowledge by Claudio Naranjo, they were less aware of that dimension of type. But I also want to emphasize that subtypes are sub passions, in my view, which means they are ways that the passions of type manifest. And again, passions are the main emotional vice for each of the 9 types, and which occupies a lot of the heart space for the person, and then the person cannot grow much beyond those feelings. And the passion, we need to understand this, it's not obvious. People think it may be obvious, but it's not. They are not obvious, the passions, and they have so many unconscious manifestations, indirect manifestations, and many of them are related to the subtypes. Subtypes make us manifest the passion of our type in specific ways, and even Enneagram teachers can miss out that people are of that type because they don't know that particular manifestation of the type's passion.
Yes, and of course the passion is that central motivation, stemming from the heart center, that is often very unconscious, as Uranio says, and but often directs a lot of different emotional patterns and behavioral patterns as well.
Mhm.
And in concert with the dominant instinct, kind of combines together in an alchemical mix to create a kind of sub personality, right? So there are 3 kinds of 4s, there are 3 kinds of 3s, 3 kinds of 6s, 3 kinds of 9s, not just one. And if we put all of one type in one bucket, we miss a lot of the nuances that people experience when they are experiencing their type. And these nuances, we believe, are really accounted for much more at the subtype level when we can describe the 3 different versions. Because you almost can't talk about one person of a particular type because they can be really, really different according to subtype. And we believe that it's very, very important to include these nuances when we talk about the Enneagram types in any meaningful way, if we're applying them in a way where we expect them to really help us in our inner growth journey.
Mhm. Agreed.
And just to add to that, I think the subtypes also clarify how the instincts operate, not only how the passion operates, but I think when people don't follow the Claudio Naranjo version, uh, the approach that we use, to me, the subtype descriptions seem a little more watered down. There's not as much substance. There's not as much definition. There's not as much deep, sort of really clarifying nuance, at that, and we'll point some of these out as we go through the types. But then what also happens is people think the instincts are more generic than they really are. They think, for instance, all self-preservation dominant people do this, this, and this. All self-preservation dominants focus a lot on money and how much money they have in the bank in the same way, or on seeking safety in the way, or think in the same way, or looking at resources or food, or comfort in exactly the same way. But when we combine the instincts with the types and this approach to subtypes, we find that the instincts can look really different depending on what type you are and how they manifest. And so I think another thing that ends up happening is people approach the instincts as a little bit more general and than they really are in practice when they combine with the type in this alchemical way.
Right. I think that instincts are operating sometimes in ways that are described by people. But the thing is, the different centers of intelligence in the human being are mixed up. And the same way that the passion gets disguised by the subtype, the dominant instinct does too. And we could say that that the subtype also creates indirect manifestations of the dominant instinct. And it's important to know, therefore, that that operation of the instinct is many times unconscious or even hidden because of what is called civilization. People who are more civilized and try to adapt to society won't go around just showing that raw instinct, dominant instinct to people in ways as if they were cavemen and cavewomen. Knowing the subtypes is a way to know how we disguise both our dominant instincts and our passion.
Right. Exactly. So maybe there's more to say general in terms of general points, but we'll probably pick those up as we go along. Maybe it's a good idea to talk about the nine types and identify some of these common mistakes or misconceptions that may occur when subtype isn't taken into account as a clarifying lens through which to really understand the nine types at a deep level, because we're taking into account exactly the different forms that they show up in practice.
Right.
So, do you want to start with type 8?
I can if you want. Feel free to also start if you prefer. So I think that sometimes people stereotype eights as being extroverted, as being out there, outgoing, speaking a lot, talking loudly, and I don't see this at all with some eights, like the self-preservation eight. And also, sometimes people think that eights have kind of a language that is more obviously aggressive. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes I don't see that with social eights for reasons that we have explained in the episodes we talked about subtypes. But maybe you would like to elaborate on this or add another topic.
So, I think in terms of eights, I think sometimes people have some stereotypes about eights as always being angry or angry in the same way or always dominating, relationships or situations. And I think, like you said, for instance, the self preservation eight I find to be much more self contained. I think sometimes self preservation eights can almost look like fives. And I think people don't understand that an eight can kind of look five ish, like a little bit more private. More concerned with their own sort of smaller sphere of influence than needing to control or have power in general, and that these eights can be just sort of keep to themselves more. There's an armor there that is important, but they may not be seeking power or needing to have power and control over everything that's happening or in as big a way as people sometimes believe. And I also think, as you said, the social eight is the counter type, right? So it's an eight that's both rebellious and pushing against authority as eights do, but also very oriented toward taking care of others, protecting others, watching out for others, in such a way that they can even look a bit like a two. And sometimes I think social eights get mistyped as twos or they're not understood. I also think that social eights, the level at which they take care of others and don't receive care themselves, sometimes isn't seen by people. I think when people find out they're social eights, a big part of their growth path is recognizing that they really don't receive very much at all. They don't ask for help, and they're so focused on using their considerable strength to lift other people up, include others, help others. Sometimes, especially people they perceive as weak and needing protection, but they really don't have a hard time being cared for themselves, and especially if they have self-preservation repressed, I would say. And in terms of the sexual eight, I think sexual eights can actually be quite emotional and really bring a lot of intensity, passion, emotion to relationships. And I think sometimes people just think eights are only emotional when it comes to being angry. But I think they can bring a wider range of emotions, and especially passion and intensity, to the way they interact in ways that almost make them look like a heart type sometimes in some cases. And I think some people don't see that nuance.
Yeah, and also sexual aids at times, they say very good things about themselves as if they are self-promoting,
Mm.
and that can be seen as a concern with image.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
actually, in my view, what's behind is a power game.
Mm.
Like I want to be central and look at me as this magnetic person,
Mm.
and I trust myself. And if others don't see that, they don't really care. It's not image, and they make sure that the domination happens. But they have this whole speech that might look like a heart type, and sometimes a 4, sometimes a 3. Just that it's not. It can look like image, but it has another motivation. But I also want to comment on differences that I see on eights in the workplace.
Mm.
And therefore, people stereotyping eights in the wrong way and sometimes mistyping them. So when I see eights that are team leaders and talking about how they relate to their subordinates, not to peers, not to bosses, but to subordinates, I see huge differences between subtypes. So self-press eights, in my experience, get very demanding of each person, but in a way that they make it clear what they expect. And they don't talk much. They might ask, and they do an excellent follow through, but it's almost like each person needs to do their work in an individual basis, and I'm watching, right? But I'm not truly controlling each step. As all aids tend to control a bit more, but it's not as challenging every day like sexual aids are. They are constantly challenging of their teams. They are always poking people, provoking, and saying things that are hard. And then social weights are super protective of their teams, even to the point of not showing flaws, or just covering those flaws for people of their team, and really fighting more against peers and bosses to protect their own. Although, to an extent, all aides will be more prone to produce some rivalry with bosses, with figures of authority. But I see these huge differences, and sometimes people who don't know subtypes and work with the Enneagram, they see one of those aspects and they say, this person can't be an 8. And that's a
Right.
mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I think when people don't have a wide enough perspective on how the different types can show up in ways that you sometimes don't expect when you're only thinking about one eight, then it's limiting in terms of how they understand eights, particular individual eights. Okay, so should we talk about type 9?
Sure. You probably have heard about CP Online. What is it? It's our platform at Chestnut Pies Enneagram Academy. On CP Online, you get access to Bea and Uranio. You can ask questions. We have Q&A sessions. You can participate live in monthly webinars. You actually join an international community with Enneagram enthusiasts from 6 different continents around the world. It's a library of over 100 hours of content. Actually, I think way more by now. Very few examples for you to know a little bit of all you can find at CP Online if you become a member. You can use a coupon sub25 SUB25 for 25% discount off your first year of membership. It will be worthwhile. So we hope to have you as one of our members at CP Online and to see you there in our webinars.
Do you want to start us
I
off?
can, yeah. So I'll start again with communication styles, and I think self-press aids can be very short in how they communicate. Although I see some self-press aids that talk a lot, but it's not that common. I think they can look like fives at times in the communication way, and also sometimes like eights in how they look like, because they tend to have, you know, how do you call it? Be the a rough edge, a ruthless edge.
Ruthless Edge,
Yeah.
yeah.
So they might look like eights, but in the way they communicate, then they might even not show the excessive mediating style. And they are also very concrete self-press aids, similar to self-press 9, sorry, similar to self-press 8s.
Mm.
And then social 9s are they talk a little bit more. Usually they are a bit more indirect in the way they communicate, many times not very concrete. And sometimes we say that the communication style for 9s is more like the saga, explaining something in length from the beginning. But that, I think, is more applies more to the social 9 than the self-press 9. And then sexual 9s, I noticed that they start communicating like the other person they spend time with. They start acquiring their style, their way of communicating. It's like it's easy to know who that person has been with in the last 24 hours because you almost hear that other person talking.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I do think that when people don't understand this approach to the subtypes, they and put all nines in one bucket, they can sometimes misperceive self-preservation nines as um, they can almost have a little bit of a feel, as you say, to eights, but I think they probably look a little bit more like nines. But I think they don't understand the concrete nature, but also how hard they are to move. Because it's very different. The self-pres 9 in turn, they're more grounded. They're sort of more stubborn, or more obviously stubborn than the other two nines. And the social 9, especially, which is the counter type, I think can be very active. Someone who's doing a lot, someone who is sort of very happy, upbeat looking, such that they can sometimes be mistyped as threes or twos, and they can really not be understood. Like, where is the sloth? Where is the, the dragging their feet or the slow moving pace that we sometimes associate with nines? And so a lot of, I think, social nines really end up, thinking, well, I must be a three or a two because I'm more active and less obviously passive aggressive. Like the sloth, which is the passion of type 9, which is a kind of self forgetting or not paying attention to one's own sense of being and one's own agenda. It gets masked by activity, right? Busy, being really, really busy by doing a lot and doing a lot for others. And of course, one reason why we know they're not twos or threes is because although they may be aware of their desire to help people or to in some cases, be the person who's like the benevolent leader. They don't really do it for recognition. They're doing it more for a sense of belonging, a belonging sense of belonging that they don't end up feeling. But they're not. They almost feel uncomfortable when they receive recognition or the kind of accolades that twos and threes really go for. And I think that with the sexual nine, um, people cannot really realize to what degree they really merge with others. Of course, all nines merge to some degree with other people, meaning they mix up their energy. They kind of become the other to a degree. They energetically mix themselves up to the point where they're not really sure sometimes where the boundaries are between them and someone else. But sexual nines really do that the most, and they can be really so focused on the other in such a big way that I think people don't really understand that aspect of sexual nines, that there's this almost umbilical connection they feel with someone else where they can really take on or sort of energetically absorb somebody else's energy or somebody else's opinions or reason for being and not have their own as much and not see those boundaries. I think sometimes people don't, and I think sometimes sexual nines can also get mistyped as heart types because they can be a bit more emotional, but they tend to not be as assertive because they're so much in service of the connection, and that connection goes so deep and it's so energetic.
Yeah, I want to build on a few things that you have already said. I think that self-present nines are the real stubborn people, while the social nines and the sexual nines are more passive aggressive in
Mm.
other ways,
Hmm.
not necessarily with stubbornness, especially when self-preservation is last
Hmm.
and in the instinctual sequence. Although all nines are stubborn to a point, it's completely different for a self-pressed nine. That's what I would call classic stubbornness. Also, we used to say that all nines seek for comfort. And I totally agree with that, no doubt. But the kind of comfort changes significantly.
Mm.
So for self-pressed nines, there is always in the center the physical comfort in some way, like the couch in the living room, or the bed, or food, or something like that. While the social seeks for the comfort of belonging,
Mm.
and then they relax in a way that's not really relaxing. It's self-forgetting, it's love. So it's a very different kind of comfort. And for sexuals, it's the comfort of being merged with that significant other, or that important other
Mm-hmm.
person in their lives
Right.
at the moment. So, as you said, I think that sexual nines are the ones that truly merge with others. I think that even when sexual instinct is last for a nine, it's even a bit difficult to say that they merge. I would use another word, perhaps. Although we might say that to a degree all nines merge. Maybe it's so different than what happens with a sexual nine that we could find another word, like losing myself on the other at times in terms of opinions and more. But it's really very different in terms of the level of merging.
Right. Right. So let's talk about ones.
Okay, so yeah, I think a basic thing is not all ones are perfectionists, and
Right.
if the person's not a perfectionist in the detail-oriented
Mm-hmm.
way, they can still be ones. Yes,
Right.
especially if self-pres is last, you won't see as much of that feature. Also, sometimes ones don't show as much of the self-criticism tendency as we think, although they are always very self-critical, very, and they will tell you probably that they are, but they don't easily show that. For instance, if they are sexual ones with social second, it might not show as being too self-critical. And one third thing is, I find the level of rigidity in the body not in behaviors, but in the body, very different for all three kinds of ones. They're all three subtypes, and especially I don't see social ones being as stiff in their bodies usually as like self-pressed ones are.
Mm-hmm.
So more from a somatic way, I think there are also big differences. But what do you think?
Well, what about the sexual one when it comes to rigidity? I know people are probably wondering about
I
that.
think they are rigid, not as much though as self-pressed ones. I think self-pressed ones are unbeatable in
Yeah,
being contracted in their bodies, and
right.
the rigidity of social ones get channeled more to a speech of what's right,
Mm-hmm.
and they are more rigid in how they speak, what they say. I remember Claudio Naranjo saying that this sometimes is the one more concerned with grammar, with
Mm.
rules of
Mm-hmm.
language,
Mm-hmm.
and so they can channel part of that stiffness to things like language.
Mm-hmm.
But then sexual ones, they are contracted, but they can at times let go of part of that contraction when they push anger out.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of it, not most of it, but a good part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Different than self-pressed ones that keep it almost all inside the anger, I mean. So I don't see, I think that I notice more easily the anger, even if contained, on ones, or sexual ones, than on other ones, as in ready to attack, more prone to explode than the other ones. And I think that brings them a bit less contraction in the body. So I think there are different levels of stiffness in the body for ones.
Mm. I also was I learned so much about ones when I learned the subtypes. It's again, it's like having a spotlight shown on all the detail that you didn't see before. Like the way that self-preservation ones are the ones that repress anger the most, right? And like you said, they're also the stiffest and the most rigid in their body, and that comes from the repression of anger and the way anger is held in the body in a completely different way. And when we work with ones, we find that self-preservation ones have the hardest time getting in touch with anger and getting it out, pushing it out. And they and again the the repression of anger for self-preservation ones makes them the warmest of the ones, and makes them sort of through reaction formation in the defense mechanism in which we go unconscious to the emotion we're feeling and express its opposite. Self-preservation ones often feel more soft and warm and friendly and sweet, and not as critical. And of course, they're taking that out more on themselves on the inside, right? And how different that is from the social one who really focuses not so much on perfecting every little thing and how imperfect they are and trying to make things more perfect the way the self-preservation one does, but more toward finding that best way to live or that best way to do something or the best approach or the right way, and then living that, and how the energy of anger goes more into researching the truth and then being the owner of the truth and knowing that way, and in a way that can be more on the more conscious level, intended to help others, right? Like I'm going to bring the right way to others, and the way that social ones don't feel that comfortable in a group, because of course one of the stereotypes of the instincts is that all social dominants like being in groups, gravitate toward groups, want to be in the group, feel comfortable. And that's not true of all the subtypes. And the social one is one of those who can feel awkward in the middle of the group because their coping strategy is to be a little bit outside and above and being the role model or being the teacher. And I hadn't really separated that out from the one who's more perfectionistic until I saw this approach. And also the way social ones, they repress anger halfway, and so they come off as more cool, more intellectual. They can look sort of five-ish. I think sometimes social ones get mistaken for fives, and vice versa. And so there is a way that they actually feel more comfortable being a little bit more on their own, and focusing on doing things the right way on their own and not adapting to the way other people do things. And oh, I wanted to say, based on what you said about social ones, I wanted to add, my father is a social one, as some of you have heard me say, and I got him a sweatshirt once that says, "I'm silently correcting your grammar," and it never stops being funny. No
Yes.
matter how much I see him wearing that sweatshirt, it's always funny, like it's the first time I saw it. So there's something about that, that he often won't say it out loud. He might to in some contexts or to his children, but not to everyone. And then how the sexual one is, I've come to have a lot of compassion for sexual ones, because I kind of get the feeling sometimes that they have this big inner conflict inside between feeling anger and holding it back. Feeling anger and holding it back. And of course, all the ones hold back anger, but I think it wants to come out more in the sexual one. They tend to focus more on criticizing others. So there's the angry energy is a little more directed to fixing things out there in the world. It could be, getting behind a social cause, not necessarily fixing a particular individual person, but there is that energy of wanting to make things better. That's kind of fiery, and it has that heat of anger. And yet, there's also in the sexual one, like the other ones, an awareness of, I don't necessarily want to put my anger out there. I also need to control it to be appropriate, or to because other people have reacted badly to it before. But there is that sort of zeal, that more fiery energy that also gets sort of, that has to feel controlled, which I think can lead to a kind of more inner conflict.
Right, right. Yeah, while social ones look like fives, and I totally agree, in the very beginning, I would mistake social ones for fives. Then I'd say self press ones look like sixes,
Right.
sometimes twos, and then sexual ones look like eights.
Hmm.
So, not knowing the subtype leads to mistyping in these particular ways.
Exactly. I've also noticed that, and this is sort of a theory I'm not 100% sure about, but I've also seen some sexual ones, women, so female sexual ones, that can look like twos, actually, because they're kind of being appropriate, but they're also sort of a little bit in other people's business, right? So trying to get in there and fix somebody else, but they can also be excessively polite, so I've seen sexual one more often in women that look like twos as well.
Is this a good segue to choose?
Yeah, yeah, let's talk about twos.
So I'll start, but I want to hear from you mostly as a true yourself. I think a very big difference is in the seduction style. All choose seduce quite a bit, coming mostly, I think, from the fixation of flattery, wanting to impact the other one positively. But the self-press one is the
You mean the
cute.
self-pres two?
The self-press two is more like cute and seducing this way. Then I'd say that the seduction style for social choose is more like becoming very influential and charismatic in the social way, and because they become powerful and they know everybody, and I think, by the way, that they are the ones that make the most compliments to people, like the classic flattery, and then the sexual true is sexually appealing as a way to seduce. Very big for them. So it's not really accurate to say that all Jews will be concerned with being sexually appealing, or like I heard people in the past saying, oh, all Jews will have long hair and they will do this and that, especially women, like lionesses. I've seen many people stereotyping Jews as that in the past. um, Even, I must say, people that came from this very, very appropriate theory by Naranjo. So I think it's important to understand that, according to what kind of seduction the people are relying on to feel good about themselves, then they will really look differently.
Right. Yeah, of course, as a two myself, hearing this approach to the twos and all of the subtypes really, but the twos, as it's my type, was life changing, right? Because again, I was putting all twos in one bucket. And I would be on Enneagram panels because I went through the narrative training and would do panels myself and be on panels for early on in my Enneagram career. And there were some twos I couldn't relate to, and they felt so different than me. And so hearing about the three twos was enormously clarifying. First of all, I learned so much about myself because I think I was putting myself in the larger two bucket, right? And misunderstanding some things about myself. And because, like all the twos, I focus a lot on relationship. I first thought I was actually a sexual two because I had such a strong focus on relationship, and because I was, in the early days, I got the sense that you figure out what subtype you are by how neurotic you are. And I was very neurotic about one-to-one relationships, partly because I had so much fear of being rejected or putting myself out there and someone not liking me or being attracted to me in the way I might want them to be. But when I found out that I was a self-preservation too, the huge thing that it taught me that I think a lot of people who don't know this approach still don't really completely get is how fearful I was as a two. And it's self-preservation fear, but in the two, it comes a little bit more like I really want to connect with people. I really want to put myself out there. But I also am very afraid of rejection, of what will be asked of me, of starting to meet someone's needs and then not being able to decide I don't want to and make a boundary, and other things. And it's made me more of a shy person. And sometimes people would doubt if I was a two, not very often, but sometimes, and maybe even think I was a six because I did have more fear there. And again, before I found out I was self-preservation too, I didn't see that fear. And we twos can repress emotions, and we can, out of pride, not want to see certain things in ourselves. So it really helped me see a lot of blind spots, and especially around fear and insecurity, but also around sort of having unconscious dependency on others while also thinking I was independent. And of course, it also clarified the difference between a self-preservation too that's more fearful, that takes a posture more like a child. And every time I say that, it's a bit humiliating because pride doesn't like to be seen as childlike and all the things that can go along with that. But the social twos being so different, almost a two that feels more like an eight, that's more powerful, that has an easier time being in front of a crowd and speaking to people, that wants to be influential in kind of a bigger stage, has more ambition. I always knew I had some ambition, but I sort of keep it under wraps. Like I don't want anyone to know about it because what if I fail at something? And of course, there's a lot of fear of that I might fail or I might not manifest in the way I want to. And so I need to sort of stay on the down low. There was a flying under the radar aspect to me as a two that I never found in the descriptions, but I did find in the self-preservation two. So the social two being the two that's more controlling of others because they want to be more influential, that can be even more manipulative, and I definitely can be manipulative, but almost even more on in a down low and a hidden way. If I'm going to be manipulative, I had a little bit more sense of wanting to really do it in a way that nobody saw, but of course people did see in ways I didn't see. But the social two being that more of that eight-ish, more out there, more powerful in the world than I always felt like I was. And I, of course, had a lot more trouble, like speaking in front of people, a lot more fear. And again, that all made sense when I found this approach. And then the sexual two, I think, being the two that is differentiated from the other twos that we've just described, but being more intense, like intensely moving toward other people, and it's funny because one time I was talking to a sexual two when we were doing an exercise in one of our retreats, and I remember we had a lot of similar ways that we see the world or react to things, but one difference is when we get like hurt by someone or when we start to feel trouble in a relationship, I move away and she'll move toward. Right. So it's a two that moves toward people more with more intensity, with more of a sort of a willingness to be attractive and enter into relationship and with a little more confidence that they can win that person over, that person will be attracted to them. Whereas was so much more aware of having more fear and more of a sense that I wouldn't be found attractive, so why put myself out there? So those differences were clarified so much for me when I found this. And I do find when I do typing interviews with people that a lot of self-pres twos don't find themselves as twos because it is this kind of counter type, doesn't appear like we often think that a two will appear.
Right, good points. I want to ask you a question about choose and the three subtypes. Um, do, do, how do you see the differences between the three subtypes of choose when it comes to self-promoting and also showing off?
That's a good question. I know for me as a self-preservation too, it's been very challenging to self-promote. It's a real challenge. It feels uncomfortable. It feels, I will say especially once I learned the Enneagram, I have fear of pride, right? So I have fear that if I self promote, people will see me as bragging, or a little bit like we talk about the three, as wanting to be like thinking I'm so great, so I have a lot of ambivalence and fear of self promotion. Whereas I think social twos are better at it, especially if it's about a company or a job or a role they take on. I think they can be quite good at it. And then I think sexual twos can be better at self promotion, but also have an underlying layer of insecurity because it's so important that people find them attractive, that I think there can be also some fear about them not being seen the way they really want people to see them. But maybe more effort goes in that direction a little more easily. Um, but that's just my initial take. I haven't really thought about that, but it's a good question.
Should we move on to threes?
Yeah. So why don't you start? Since I've been talking a lot, hopefully not too much about twos.
No, it was very good. So, a few things about threes. One is some threes don't care as much, at least consciously and behavior wise, about image. And some threes don't care as much, at least clearly, about goals. And sometimes we say all threes are about goals and all threes are about images. But to me, it really depends. And I must say, not only on subtype, but also on the whole instinctual sequence, in my view. I just see that like social threes with self-pres repressed, they might talk about goals for others, but they don't care as much, and they adapt so easily to other goals, even when they haven't accomplished those. It's not as big for them, and then self-pres threes with social last perhaps are not very much concerned with public image. And then image wise, the social three is more like really I need to be seen and applauded and revered even by everybody. While the sexual three is more by that one person or those few people. When I get close to them, they don't really care as much about the whole public. Mm-hmm. Right, this is one thing, and then maybe you can say something. Then I want to say differences about the concept of success for each of the three.
Great. I like too the way you're highlighting sequences, instinctual sequences, because because this approach to the subtypes, in my opinion, is so accurate, again, according to by the testing we've done by using this with people in the field or in our retreats and workshops, working with people individually as we do in coaching even. I think there's a way that we see how the instinctual sequences also create more nuances when you know the subtypes, because it's a sequence of the way the person relates to the subtypes. But main thing I want to say about the threes, and again, this approach really landed for me um, in a big way when it came to the threes, because what I think is most people out there that don't use this approach believe that all threes are social threes. Like the only three is a social three. A lot of people believe that all threes are really competitive. All threes can be aggressive and sort of wanting to win or wanting to be the best or wanting to be seen on stage as in a really positive way as super successful. And I think, of course, all those traits do apply to all the threes, but especially that's the social three. And when I learned this approach, I thought, wow, I'd never even heard of the self-preservation three or the sexual three, that these were completely different types or versions of three that I never, ever would have known or seen or identified if it wasn't for this approach. And again, it's the value of this approach is sort of putting in the three different buckets, what tends to be put in one bucket. So in a way that the definition, the nuance is muddied up. So I think the social three is really the three that gets written about in a lot of the books as that um, person who really cares about image and who has a really good image because they're so good at creating an image of success and really wanting to have the designer label or the big job or the nice car and feeling really great about that and almost having a confidence that they can reach any goal and win any contest. And all of this is the social three, whereas the self-pres three is really different. They tend to be more modest in that they, because of the self-preservation instinct, they're focused more on being good, not only looking good, but being good. You've got to actually do the good job because there's more anxiety about getting it right, not just looking good, like being the good model of there's a more of an influence of morality, being a good person. And so they can look like ones. And I think a lot of self-pres threes get mistyped as ones. And of course, the difference being that the one has this internal gut sense of right and wrong that they tend to apply, whereas the self-pres three is defining good as defined by the social context they're in. But that sense of like vanity for having no vanity, like they aim not to deceive others about who they are. They just don't know who they are and they don't know that they don't know, so the self-deceit is really in there despite their desire to be good and to show up as who they really are. They just don't know what the confusion is. And of course, they're super workaholics and have the hardest time slowing down because there is this anxiety underneath and this need to be good and provide this sense of really big focus on material security in a way that makes them work hard to provide security for everybody around them. And then of course the sexual three being a more two-ish three, more of a pleaser, more of someone who's really focused on attracting other people by their image, by the way they are, and has a kind of charisma. And the Naranjo name of original name of masculine feminine to was changed later to charisma, which I really like because I find sexual threes have this kind of attractiveness that's hard to put your finger on. It's often physical, but not just physical. Like there's something about their manner. And I would never have known this. They're also the type of all 27 who's least connected to themselves. And because of that, I think the sexual three mistypes a lot because they don't know who they are, right?
Yes.
So it's well-meaning. There's a way that they're trying to find out their type, but they may have identified with another type that is who important people in their lives wanted them to be or look like, right? So they can have a real genuine confusion inside about who they really are, which is another way of having a hard time finding your type.
Yes, yeah, very good points. And when it comes to success, I think it's important to understand that while most threes of all three subtypes will see success through the lenses of their careers, not all of them, but most of all three subtypes, the actual goal for them, goals for them are different, and the way they see the end result that will make them be successful is really different. So for self-pressed threes, I think it's truly money and financial security. And then for social threes, it's a lot about status. Success is way more related to that. And then for sexual threes, it's more about I've built my career or my life, but am I admired by that person I live with,
Right.
those few friends I have?
Right, right. That
So
important other person. It could be a spouse or somebody else.
good. So moving on to four.
Yeah.
Okay, so you always teach how the three subtypes of four can make them look very, very different. And then so many mistypes we see all the time. I'd say sexual force being really mistyped by as eights or as threes at times. Social force sometimes I think as nines, sometimes as fives, but I want to hear what you think. And then what I want to say about self-press force regarding mistyping is that it's all around. They can be mistyped by any other, but mostly it's very hard for people who don't understand subtypes to see how those self-pressed force have envy as the passion.
Hmm.
So I think people many times think they are not forced because it's way harder to see envy there.
Hmm. Right, right. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I think self-preservation four is, of course, top of the list of the type that doesn't even exist in some people's minds when they only talk about the nine types, or when they use other versions of the subtypes that aren't quite as well defined, in my opinion, as this approach from Claudio Narajano. So I, it. I mean, it's such a sad irony that the one type that most feels misunderstood, type four, when people don't understand the subtypes, there can be a lot of misunderstanding about fours, and of course, a lot of people today in social media and other places still deny the existence of self-preservation four in the way we describe it, as someone who internalizes suffering and makes a virtue of suffering. That's the coping strategy, such that they can look sort of sunny on the outside. People say there's no such thing as a happy four. Well, it isn't really a truly deeply happy four. It's someone who the four who still feels pain but holds it on the inside and puts on a happy face, shapeshifts a little bit more than the other two fours, more like twos and threes. They put on a happy face for others, but the self-pres fours usually know they're doing that, and they usually are doing that because there's a self-preservation angle on connection. Like, in order to survive, you need to be connected to others, and self-preservation fours often get the message in childhood that I'll only connect with you and take care of you if you hide your darker feelings, if you don't cry and just look happy. So it's at the appearance of lightness, and sometimes there can be some, happiness, but it doesn't go deep. It's
Yeah.
that person is feeling pain on the inside. And then for me, that the nuances of separating out the three fours, that the social four is the four that suffers more openly, right? And again, I think sometimes when we put all fours in one bucket, everyone thinks that the four that suffers more openly, that
It was an open
who's
book,
an open
which
book,
is a
yes,
myth. A myth. Yeah.
exactly, who sees themselves as not good enough, inferior, compares themselves and winds up on the bottom. And then that means the sexual four isn't understood and included, because the sexual four is someone who externalizes their suffering, and someone who leads with anger, and anger as a shield against feeling shame and sadness inside. And so all of what we're saying about these fours also helps define three different inner growth paths. So they're really important nuances about the three kinds of fours, so that we can understand them and they can understand themselves, that I think are really muddied up together when people don't use this clarification that this subtype approach brings.
Hmm. Good. Yeah, and also not all fours express sadness as easily.
Yeah.
Like the sexual four is much more about anger, and sadness can
Mhm.
get a bit hidden even.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now let's move on to five.
Okay.
Um, so one thing is how much fives seek for privacy in the physical space.
Yeah.
I think all fives do. All
Mhm.
fives feel very good about being with themselves at times and
Mhm.
closing the doors,
Mhm.
but it's more for self-pressed fives, and it's like it's an extremely big preference
Mhm.
constantly.
Mhm.
While, for instance, for me as a social five, while that is pleasant,
Mhm.
it's more about deciding how I spend my time,
Mhm.
more than having my own physical space
Mhm.
and being more about my own agenda.
Mhm.
Then for sexual fives, I think it can be a little bit of both, but it's more like being in their inner worlds, feeling dash thinking, and making sure that people don't take them out of that
Mm.
as their hideouts, their preferred hideouts. But maybe you could say other things about fives than I add.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the differentiation of the three fives into really how they have, even though they share many characteristics. And I remember one time when we were in Brazil, we did a panel in one of our professional workshops because we had you there. We had a self-preservation five, a social five, at least one of each, and a sexual five. And so we did kind of a panel to talk about what the three experiences were. And I remember very clearly you each related a lot to each other, right? So there's a lot of shared
Yeah.
characteristics with the five. And Naranjo would say that the fives look most alike from the outside, especially. They look similar, but there's particular different focuses and feels to the different fives. I think the self-preservation five is someone who does focus more on boundaries, on having on being able to withdraw when they want to a place of safety, but also they tend to be really warm and friendly. It's almost like if you're a little more confident and aware of making boundaries, you can be more friendly and open at times as well. And I think the social five focuses more on learning, knowledge, being the one who knows, being the one who is focused on the collective in particular ways, social causes, expert knowledge that serves a social cause, and that they can, because that's their focus, they can be a little more comfortable being out there and on stage, because if you're someone who knows a lot and seeks to be an expert and an expert among other experts, there can be almost like a bigger motivation to share that information and be out there on behalf of a social cause or a value that you feel strongly. And then the sexual five, being the five that has a little bit more of that romantic streak, a little bit more of the desire to go deeper with someone, but not everybody, just the special person and this kind of idealization of that special person they'll find and they can go deeper, but still having a lot of, boundaries and unwillingness to be open all the time to everyone, or to be an open book, so more still that sort of protective barrier, but kind of on the lookout for someone they can share more of their inner emotional life with in the ways they might want to.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that self-press fives are the most typical observers,
Mm,
while social fives are way more about being on stage and
yeah.
being seen as the most knowledgeable ones. And as you said about knowledge, sometimes I prefer to say about learning more
Mm-hmm.
than knowledge,
Mm,
although it's really an asset for social
mm-hmm.
fives to have some kind of degree of information and knowledge with themselves as as money to trade
Mm,
almost.
mm-hmm.
And then sexuals, I think, are a lot about processing things that happened, and mentally most of all, but being in that space of learning by processing things. Now, for me, I just want to share this. Being on stage has always been very comfortable as a social
Hmm.
five, always. In high school, I would, be the one doing speeches at school, and then, in many different places. And it's crazy thinking uh, retroactively. I had my first training company when
Hmm.
I was 21.
Wow.
Who is a 21-year-old that thinks they can have a training company?
Good point.
So it's like, it's very comfortable, especially in groups. For me, not as comfortable with in the one-on-one basis, although sexual is my second. So I think there is a really big, big stereotype talking about the fact that fives need to always be introverts.
Yes.
It has always been hard for me to decide if I'm more an introvert or an extrovert.
Mm.
And on Myers-Briggs, I rank as extrovert,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I really love to be with myself and retract and reflect. So I have a need for being reserved somehow.
Hmm.
But I also really like sharing and talking and spreading knowledge and socializing, more in other moments of my life than now. But yeah, I don't think saying that all fives are introverts is very accurate. And another thing is, don't say that fives are shy. There are
Mm.
many fives that are shy, but it's not the majority.
Mm.
And I see like nines statistically being more shy than fives. It's
Hmm.
really about being reserved,
Right,
not shy.
right. And I think the self-preservation is the most reserved. But even and I liked what you said about the self-preservation being the biggest observer. I really find that to be true. And I think of one of my dear friends who is a self-preservation five, and she's really funny. She says sometimes when she's at airports with her family, she loves to listen to what's going on at the table next door. We sometimes she says she would like to be one of her sort of careers that she didn't manifest, that she would like to be as a private investigator.
Mm.
So it's that sort of fascination with people, but from a safe distance, that I think is more true of the self-preservation five. And as you say, and I've worked with social fives in business where I find them to be a very assertive and
Yes.
very powerful in the
Yeah.
way they speak and the way they represent their opinions,
Mm.
and the power they hold in a team. So I
Mm.
do think that it's important to recognize that not all fives are introverted and reserved.
But also, I think social fives are a bit more controlling
Yes,
than
yes.
other
Sorry, I said
than
yes a
not.
little bit too enthusiastically there. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I agree.
Okay, then. Yeah, good to know.
Moving on to sixes.
Yes. So, yeah, so different, the three subtypes of sixes. And I think it's important to talk about misconceptions here. Um, so sometimes we say self-pressed sixes are really warm and sexual sixes are like intimidating. I agree with that. But in practice, I know, for instance, people who are like a family member of mine is a sexual six with a very high self-press. And I see this paradox in him of being someone really assertive in his opinions and provocative, but at the same time telling jokes to everybody
Mm,
and being nice and making other people laugh. So sometimes it's very hard to say if the person is more intimidating or more warm in
mm,
my
mhm,
particular
mhm,
sense.
mhm.
So I think that even us, we need to start watching for stereotypes, we
Yeah.
might say, because we consider only the subtype and not the whole sequence. But also, it's very important to say it's the relationship between the six and doubt is very different. Like for social sixes, it's not there isn't as much doubt when it comes to the area of work they have, although there may be a lot of doubt when it comes to other areas of life. So, and also how much the six ask questions more than give answers. It's true that all sixes do that more than others, but it's incomparable how much that's a big thing for a self-press six. Only asking questions, never making affirmations. So I just see that people might mistake sixes for others, like sexual six as being an eight, or self-press six as being a two, and social six as being a three or a one, because of those tiles.
Right. And I do think that the sequences become very interesting with sixes because, and I do find that sometimes sixes have the hardest time finding their subtype and their sequence. And because there can be a lot of paradox, right? So there can be, if you have, like in your example, a sexual six that's more counterphobic, more assertive, more aggressive, and then the second one right after that is the self-pres, which is sort of the opposite, in that they're much more fearful, afraid of being aggressive, owning their anger, and so lead much more with warmth and friendliness. But if you have sexual and then self-pres, there can be this sort of contradiction, that sometimes you're counterphobic, other times there's a phobic response to things. So I do think that because, and Naranjo would say that the three sixes and the three fours are the most distinct from one another. So, it's almost hard to talk about one six, because one is more affectionate, one's more obedient and about duty, the social six, and one's more aggressive, the sexual six. When you then put them in a sequence, there can be more confusion about what you're dealing with. But I do think that the particular nuance of the self-preservation six being the one who's more in touch with fear, more in touch with doubt, more questioning, having a harder time being certain about anything, is an important nuance. And the fact that these three subtypes have three completely different coping strategies for dealing with fear, right? This is very important. Now, all sixes can say that before they learned the Enneagram, they weren't aware of fear. Even the self-preservation six, who's more anxious, who has more consciousness of fear, can sometimes say they called it something else, like wanting to be prepared or being perfectionistic or being a good problem solver. And it's important to recognize, though, that the self-preservation coping strategy in six is more about creating friends and allies. And so being warm and friendly as a way of evoking protection and care from others in the face of an attack. And then the social six being one that looks for a good authority. I sometimes would say before this approach, all sixes are looking for a good authority. They just rarely find one. They're always questioning or suspicious of the authority, because the authority has power over people, and power over you is going to engender fear. But the social six is the six that's looking for a good authority. But again, the authority doesn't have to be a person. They're looking for some sort of rules, reference points, guidelines, learning, knowledge that can help them relax, because they can find a way to figure out what to do when they're afraid. Whereas the sexual six being completely different, especially than the self-preservation six, of reacting to fear with aggression or assertiveness or contrarian or rebellion, when they feel fear, but not feeling the fear at all, really, and skipping over fear and vulnerability and just going into being intimidating or assertive in the face of fear that they often don't register.
In the authority theme, I think self-press sixes sometimes more mystify and even elevate other authority figures. Social sixes sort of idealize the authority
Mm-hmm.
figures, and they really want them to be good, and sometimes they see them as good when they aren't,
Mm-hmm.
with projection, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And then sexual sixes are the ones that are more constantly challenging of
Mm-hmm.
authority.
Right.
But I wanted to say something about groups.
Mm.
Social sixes to me are a bit more about causes.
Mm, yeah.
Also groups, but more causes. And groups are a bit more typical for self-pressed sixes because they have the separation anxiety, they are
Yeah.
warm, they get together with others.
Yeah.
So if people are not really aware of what the subtypes are, they might say self-pressed sixes are socials.
I agree. And I think that's an important thing, distinction. And I think the way the group shows up for the social six is, like you say, in causes, but also in just being super uber responsible.
Hmm.
Like, I'm going to be super
Yeah.
responsible for the family. I'm going to
Mhm.
think about everything, because my job is not only to be finding safety for myself, but to find safety and protection and stability for everybody, and it
Mhm.
could be in the family or in a group they're in, or the community. But it's not necessarily like I want to join a group. It's more like I feel this big responsibility to make sure we've thought of everything so that nothing bad happens to anybody in my kind of, in my circle or in my family.
Yeah, and then in even in lower levels of awareness, self-pressed sixes are aware that there is fear, but the
Yes.
other sixes aren't.
Yeah.
Not as much at
Yeah,
least.
yeah. And there's a bit more of a tendency to run away and hide in light of fear, as opposed
Hmm.
to sort of take some sort of action.
Right. So
Yeah.
sevens.
Sevens.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Go ahead. What do you want to start?
you can start.
Okay, so sevens. I think self-pressed seven is very pragmatic and sometimes prone to strategize the best ways to have success and earn money, and even at the cost of staying a little bit in initial phases that are not as pleasant in what they are doing because of that mindset. So sometimes they are seen as threes, in my
Mm,
experience,
yeah.
mistakenly.
Yep.
But then if you take sexual sevens, social sevens, they tend to be very different than that,
Hmm.
way less pragmatic. And then it depends. If you think sevens are idealistic always, you will leave out self-pressed sevens. If you think
Hmm.
sevens are opportunistic always, you will leave out sexual and
That's a
social.
good way to put it.
So it's really different, and there are mistakes made when it comes to this. And but then also I used to think, oh, all social dominants are more idealistic than the other two dominant instincts. But I see now that sexual sevens are more idealistic than social sevens
Hmm.
because of other particular things happening with sevens.
Hmm.
And at the same time, really doing for others for social seven is the opposite of what happens for self-pressed sevens,
Right.
being much more for the others than for self,
Right.
and even to the cost of totally neglecting self needs,
Right.
right? And then I see that self-pressed sevens are not really worried about how they are going to be seen by others as being good for them or not, while social sevens are a lot
Mm.
about that.
Right. Right. Yeah. And again, my mind was completely changed and expanded when I learned the subtype approach around sevens. Again, putting them all in one bucket, sure, there are certain things that you can say of all sevens, like they tend to be enthusiastic, positive, future oriented, this kind of thing. But then there are specific things that are really true of one that's not so true of the other. Like, for instance, sometimes I think sevens can be naive, but that's really the sexual seven, right? And the name, suggestibility or easy to hypnotize. This is a really specific seven that I didn't really understand. That it's a seven that really has an even stronger need to see things as positive, to the point of wearing rose colored glasses and not seeing reality in a way that's so the opposite of self preservation seven. And I often, when I work with sevens, self preservation sevens in business, I often find them saying, like, it's not true that I can't look at the negative data. Right. We often say sevens only look at the positive data, but self-press sevens want to make things happen. They want to capitalize on opportunities for themselves, but they also look a little bit more like threes because they are goal oriented and they can move things ahead and accomplish things in terms of what they set their mind to. But it's really about, how do I manage the practical reality of getting my needs met and making this happen? And in order to do that, they learn over time that you have to look at the negative data. Otherwise, it's going to be an obstacle that you're not accounting for that. So they're better at that, and they do that more readily than the other two sevens. And of course, the social seven, being the counter type, is a big counter type. And a lot of social sevens still get accused by people they run into in Enneagram communities as being a two, because the social seven really looks like a two. Because it has not only this sort of self-referencing piece, which they do still have, and the gluttony, which they do still have, like the other sevens, but it gets turned in a whole other direction, right? The gluttony and the self-referencing is more about, how can I be of service to others as a way of creating happiness and positivity in the world around me, right? I want to take away people's pain, and I sort of see that as my job, and I want to be seen as, there's a gluttony for being seen as a good person, or someone who makes other people happy, and that ends up being kind of a load that the social seven carries, that we don't know that they carry, because they put a smile on their face, and they don't always complain about the inner conflict they feel between getting their own needs met and getting what they want, because of the self-referencing, but also this strong impulse to give that up, to prove that they're good and that they can bring happiness to other people.
Right, right. And I see that while all sevens tend to be creative, I think that only the sexual seven has more of this tendency to fantasize.
Mm.
I don't see self-present social sevens doing that as much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
And it's not that the social seven is more down to earth or whatever. I think it's just that they are out there for others. They lose touch with themselves, but it's not really fantasizing.
Mm-hmm.
I think sexual sevens are the ones that fantasize more.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. So hopefully this has clarified things for people, and brought a little bit more of a finer point on some things we may have said before, but especially the crucial importance, really highlighting the crucial importance for including subtypes in a deeper understanding of the Enneagram, especially if you're using it for inner work.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
So that does it this week for the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. Join us again next time for the Enneagram 2.0 podcast, when we talk about all things Enneagram.